Have you ever dreamed of writing a book, but then almost immediately had these thoughts like, who am I kidding? I mean, who am I to write a book? Or I'm not really qualified to write a book. Or there's so many other better books out there and better writers. So maybe I shouldn't do this. Maybe you really struggle with that concept of imposter syndrome. This idea that someone's going to find out that you don't really know what you're talking about. Well, if any of those things sound like you, stick around because this video may be the thing that helps you write your book in 2025. This video is the second in a series of 3 on the actions, thoughts, and emotions of being a writer. So today we're going to focus in on the cognitions, all those thoughts swirling around in your brain, all of that self-talk, that conversation that you have with yourself, all of those things that may be limiting you in your writing. You know, you are pretty brilliant. According to the National Science Foundation, you have about 60,000 thoughts a day. And that means that if you have the ability to change your thoughts, you can quite literally change your life. Now, I know that that sounds like a daunting task. I mean, how do you change 60,000 thoughts? Keep listening because you don't need to change 60,000 thoughts, but changing a few significant ones will make a big difference. I know it sounds like a lot of work, but this is why it's worth it. For most people, 80% of the thoughts that they have every day are negative. That means that about 48,000 thoughts a day aimed directly at you are negative. You're generating these thoughts that are bringing you down, that are making you feel unqualified. But there's some good news. The good news is that about 95% of your thoughts are the same thoughts on repeat. That's 42,750 of the same thoughts every day. Tell me that's not powerful. So here's the key thing. If you could identify and capture those thoughts on repeat and change the messages they are sending to you, then you will change the way that you view life. You will change the way that you view yourself as a writer. So those are the thoughts that we're going to talk about in today's video. Well, hello. I am Denis'Thomas. I'm the author of about a dozen books, and I am a former college professor and a licensed professional counselor. In that capacity, I've spent a lot of time talking with both clients and students about the cognitions that are holding them back. Those thoughts that keep telling them that they're not good enough, or that they don't have what it takes, or that people are going to find out that they are an imposter, or any of those other kinds of thoughts that are holding them back. And if you struggle with those kinds of things too, the things that you're telling yourself about who you are as a writer or about your abilities as a writer, the first thing that you must do is identify those thoughts. Now, we in the field, we call those things faulty thinking because there is a problem with the way that you think that is leading to a problem with the results that you are getting. So with cognitive theories, you take your cognitions and you change them to change a behavior. In this case, we're talking about the behavior of writing. But if you like cognitive theory, then the idea is that the cognitions come before any actions or emotions. So if you can catch those and change them, then you change the actions and the emotions that follow. So in today's video, I want to talk about 10 strategies to change your thoughts and make a big impact on your writing. So in this video, we will specifically focus in on just those thoughts that are about writing. So here's a quick exercise to help you to begin to identify some of the thoughts that you have. Without stopping yourself or censoring yourself, I want you to notice the first thoughts that come to mind when I say the next sentence. I am going to write a book in 2025. What you just thought are some of the thoughts that you have on repeat. Now, I'm going to give you 10 different categories of thoughts, and you may be able to identify the ones that tend to be your favorites in this list. And then make sure you stay to the end of the video, because following that, I'm going to talk about what to do about it. So the first kind of faulty thinking is one of the most common, and it is all or nothing thinking. It's this idea that you have to do all of it, everything, and it must be perfect, or you do nothing at all. So here with the right method, I talk a lot about writing daily, writing 500 words every single day to add up to your manuscript. It's a really manageable and sustainable way to write a book. But if you get caught up in all or nothing thinking, then you may be thinking, if I can't do 100 days without missing, then it's not worth doing at all. So you may write for 10 days and then miss a day, and because you now do not have a perfect streak, you give up on the whole thing of writing a book. That is all or nothing thinking. And of course, it's faulty because you can write a book and miss a day. You could write a book, but it won't be in one session. It can't be. So maybe that's the kind of thinking that's holding you back. Or maybe it's this second thing that's holding you back. It is that you have this mental filter that magnifies something negative that you have heard. So maybe way back in the 5th grade, your teacher made a negative comment about your writing, and now you believe that you cannot write. Maybe in college, a professor wrote something negative in one of your papers, and now you think that the idea of writing a book is something that is beyond your capabilities. What you have done is you've put a filter on, and then you look for confirmation of that message. So see, that 5th grade teacher said it, and then your college professor said it, so it must be true. Never mind the fact that you may have written really great things in between there. No writer can write super well every single time. Just ask some writers on the bestseller list, because they may struggle with the idea of repeating that, knowing that they can't be brilliant all the time. So do you have a negative mental filter that is holding you back? Well, maybe instead you're guilty of this third negative thinking, and that is overgeneralization. Overgeneralization also magnifies messages. It takes something that may truly be true in one area, and then it over applies it everywhere else. So I missed my writing yesterday, therefore I'm a no good writer because I can't write consistently. That is an overgeneralization, because again, of course you can miss a day of writing and still be a great writer who finishes manuscripts. But if you take one thing and you overgeneralize it to the rest of your life, then that kind of thinking is going to hold you back. Do you tend to be someone who overgeneralizes? Well, maybe instead you're someone who likes to jump to conclusions. That's the next kind of faulty thinking. So an example of jumping to conclusions might be after you've written a piece and you let someone read it, and you start to watch for clues, and any little twitch or look or anything you all of a sudden interpret as they hate it, this is awful, they don't like me, they're going to try to tell me something nice to spare my feelings, but they really, really hate my writing, this is terrible, I shouldn't have let anybody read it. That is definitely jumping to conclusions. And if you tend to jump to negative conclusions, that is going to hold you back from writing. The sixth type of faulty thinking will be two polar ends of the same problem. One is magnifying and one is minimizing. So when you magnify something, this is something that we often call catastrophizing. So you take something that has happened and then you interpret it, and by the time you are done, you have made it a catastrophe. So it might look something like this. I didn't go back to the primary source on that reference. Maybe it isn't referenced properly. Maybe I've miscited. Somebody's going to accuse me of plagiarism. The publisher's going to get wind of it, and nobody will touch my work for the rest of my writing career. That, my friends, is catastrophizing. The opposite end of that is minimizing. And that is where you kind of minimize the information that you get. And so it might be something like someone points out and says, I don't know if that citation is exactly true. I think I remember it being worded differently. You might want to check that reference. And you come back with, I don't need to check that reference. I've already checked that reference. Who are you to question me in that reference? What, you think I'm not a good writer because you have read a different reference or have understood that citation differently? Might come off something like that. It's this idea that you say it's no big deal, and so you really don't pay attention to important information. That also could hold you back from writing, because instead of taking feedback as something positive, you may get defensive and really miss opportunities to make your writing better. Number 7 is a good one. This one is emotional reasoning. It is the idea where you're taking the feelings and emotions you have as facts and logic. And the reason that that is a problem is because we have lots of emotions. We have lots of competing emotions in our lives. And we have multiple of those happening throughout the day. But if you think because I feel bad about my writing is bad, then you are going to severely limit your writing because it will be based completely on how you feel. And what we know about emotions is they may be really intense, but typically when they're really intense, that lasts for about 90 seconds and then they taper off. And another thing about emotions, you may be feeling one way right now, but in 10 minutes or 30 minutes or tomorrow, you may feel really differently. So following your emotions may be problematic. Now, I'll talk about the benefits of emotions and how to work with those in your writing in the next video. I'm actually a big fan of that, and that's where I do a lot of my clinical work is around emotions. But for the purposes of this video, the problem, the faulty thinking, is when you take your emotions and believe them as facts and evidence. The next type of faulty thinking, I almost guarantee that you do. And that is using should statements. Well, Dr. Denise says I should write 500 words a day. I should write 600 words a day because I'm an overachiever. I should write 500 brilliant words a day. And if they're not brilliant, I need to redo them. I should submit my manuscript for publication on X date because that's the goal I've set for myself. Shoulds may come from messages that you get from others, but a lot of times they're generated internally, which means you're the one telling yourself what you should do. Just by changing the word should to could, you may dramatically change the impact of these type of thoughts. So I could write 500 words a day. I could write 500 brilliant words. I could submit my manuscript to the publisher on X date. That sounds really different than I should, because if you don't do what you should do, there is this following message that you are bad or you are a failure. And again, those are faulty thinking cognitions. And you don't want those because they will limit the way that you write. The next kind of faulty thinking is labeling, or more aptly, mislabeling your thoughts. And that is where you take a label that is true and applies maybe to one instance, but you apply it as an overall label. Now, the reason that this is a problem is because it might look something like this. I didn't write yesterday, therefore I am an inconsistent writer. And you have just labeled yourself as an inconsistent writer for missing one day. Now, it's pretty obvious how that can hold you back, but it doesn't allow for I was sick yesterday, or yesterday's schedule was just crazy busy. It doesn't give any sort of an allowance there. Because you missed one day, therefore you are now labeled as an inconsistent writer. You beginning to see how these faulty thoughts work? I bet you have dozens of them. Most of us do. All right, and the last kind of faulty thinking that we're going to talk about before getting to what you can do about these thoughts is personalization. Personalization is where you blame yourself for everything that goes wrong. For example, I wasn't able to write today because my computer was out of juice. It's my fault. I didn't charge my computer. And so therefore, I can't be a writer because I am not responsible enough to think of charging my computer beforehand. This can be particularly bad if you are in a stage of writing where you are submitting your work for publication and you're getting rejection letters. You may have a tendency to blame yourself. Well, I knew it wasn't good enough to be published. Well, it's my fault it didn't get published because I didn't write a good enough cover letter. Now, while it may be helpful in many ways to accept responsibility for your work and to use those negative responses as a way to help you get better, what happens with faulty thinking is that blaming yourself keeps you from resubmitting your work. So it totally holds you back. Well, if you are breathing, you probably found some of those 10 kinds of faulty thinking that really hit home for you. I mean, we all do it. In fact, we're really pretty wired to see the negative as a way to take care of ourselves. So our brains are really looking for the negative because that's often where the danger is, right? And in these days of comments and likes, we are often in overdrive looking for the negative and accentuating the negative as a way to protect ourselves, because those kinds of negative comments or not being liked, they kind of hurt. And it's a way that our brain uses to take care of you. Danger doesn't come from safe places. So by being very aware of what could be harmful, that's how your brain is protecting you. Of course, the problem with that is that if your brain is protecting you from every bad thing that can happen from your writing, well, it's going to mean that you don't write, because the safest way to protect yourself from any sort of negative review in your writing is to never publish it. But that's not what this channel's about. This channel's about getting you your book published this year. So what do you do if you're someone who's really prone to these negative thoughts? Well, remember, 80% of your thoughts are negative and 95% of your thoughts are on repeat. So really, all that you need to do is figure out what those thoughts are that are on repeat, that 95% of your thoughts, and start to adjust those. So here's 7 things you can do about it. The first one is to begin to notice your thoughts. I mean, you can't change any of them if you don't know that they happen. And if they're on repeat, they're really in the background. You may be hearing them a lot in your internal self-talk, but you may not be aware of them at all. So begin to notice those. Go back to the beginning of this video when I ask you your initial thoughts on I'm going to write a book in 2025. Let's start with those thoughts as an example. First, notice them. Begin to notice any patterns that you have with them. How often you hear yourself telling yourself that. How intense those thoughts are when you have them. Are there certain things that tend to bring up that kind of thinking? Just begin to notice. Notice the patterns, but most importantly, notice the thoughts. The second strategy is to reframe your identity. Now, if you watched last week's video on atomic habits, you know that one of James Clear's suggestions for changing your actions is to take on the identity that you want for a certain habit. So instead of being someone who writes 500 words a day, you say, I am a writer. And what follows naturally is that writers write. So reframe the way you see yourself. Instead of seeing yourself as someone with a habit of writing consistently, instead see yourself as a writer. Because writer encompasses when you take 2 weeks off. It encompasses when you have an off week. It encompasses when you are traveling. But because you write consistently and write most of the time, you are a writer. So reframe that identity and start to see yourself as a writer. All right, the third strategy for changing these faulty thoughts is that now that you have noticed them, go ahead and label them with the kind of faulty thinking that they are. Is this all or nothing thinking? Is this catastrophizing or maximizing? Oh, I just heard that I said should to myself. Maybe I'm doing that faulty thinking of I should. Whatever kind of faulty thinking you're noticing, give it a label. That will do a couple of things. First of all, as you're noticing it and identifying it, it's going to give you some really important information that your brain will just naturally start working on. But second, you probably will begin to notice which ones many of your faulty thoughts are falling in, which categories. And that may help you with some more global strategies that work on that kind of thinking, as opposed to just the negative thoughts that are holding you back from being a writer. That's a much more efficient way to work on this. So the fourth strategy is to dispute your distortions. Now, this does not mean to argue with yourself, because boy, our brains are good at accepting irrational thoughts as truth. And just arguing and trying to point out the holes in why those things aren't true probably won't work. But what will work is to dispute them by saying that is faulty thinking, which means that I already know that that's not true, even if it feels true, even if I have accepted it as true for a long time. That's all that you need to do when you are disputing. Arguing with yourself tends to not work. Early in my counseling career, I would often catch myself trying to talk someone out of the way that they thought about themselves, and it just never worked because they have come to those conclusions based on their life experiences. Something has taught them that, and if you have been having thoughts on repeat for years, if 95% of the same thoughts have been happening for decades, then you're not just going to talk yourself out of them, but you can dispute them. As you identify them, just recognize these are not truth. The fifth strategy to help you dispute these negative thoughts is to really identify why you want to write this book. Why is it important to write this book, even if you feel like an imposter? Even if someone has told you it's not any good? Even if people close to you hate what you have written? Why would you write the book anyway? Why does it matter to you? Keeping that why at the forefront of your writing is going to be really important during those very difficult to write days. And we all have difficult to write days where our thoughts are hammering us. Number 6 is kind of a cliche these days, but it's a cliche for a reason. And that is progress, not perfection. What matters in your writing is that you are advancing in it, that you are continuing to write so your manuscript is gaining in word count, so that as you write, your skills are getting better and you're becoming a better writer. That progress is what matters. Being perfect doesn't matter at all because it's an unattainable goal. What matters is that you finish your manuscript. What doesn't matter is that you have an absolutely error-free manuscript. Other people can help you with those things. And quite honestly, even traditionally published books have typos in them. Nothing is immune to imperfection. So that as your standard of what your writing must be will always be faulty thinking. Now, I'm a big fan of striving to be your best, trying to do your best work. I think that can be healthy and productive and really rewarding. But driving yourself to be perfect or else nothing is going to be destructive to your writing. So focus on your progress. And my last strategy to help you with this faulty thinking is to remember that you are writing for someone who needs to read your words. If you were talking to your best friend and you stumbled over your words as you were trying to encourage them, would you be worried that that encouragement wasn't good enough? Probably not. you would be trying to help your friend. And that's what you're doing with your writing. You are writing for someone who needs to read your words. They don't need to read your perfection. In fact, perfection is often unrelatable. So an imperfection can be something that connects you with your reader. And if they need your words, they need you to write them. I mean, how many times have you read something that made you pause and think? Or maybe you heard something that made that pivotal change. For me, it was a simple, offhanded conversation in the break room with one of my colleagues, which I can't even remember the exact words that she used. But I walked away from that conversation with this idea that if I wanted to be a writer, I needed to start writing consistently. That changed my writing life, but it happened because she said something, not because she said something perfectly. You don't have to be a perfect writer, but you do need to be a writer for those who need to read your writing. So there are 10 kinds of faulty cognitions that many of us struggle with, and 7 things to do about it. I hope this helps you in your writing life. So I really encourage you today to start to really notice that self-talk, the things that you say to yourself on repeat, and maybe pick one to work on and change. Well, if you're interested in seeing how people successfully won at writing 50,000 words in 1 month, and some counters to some of this negative thinking, then you might want to watch this video